أعوذ بالله من السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعجل فرجه. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you on behalf of Anjuman Safina Najat ASN, Heir Town, DHA, Rawalpindi, Islamabad, from Pakistan, on this very unique interactive session in which we have tried to engage the global speakers of scholarly repute. The purpose and intent of this session is to promote and enhance interfaith harmony through the message of Karbala. As we all know that we have just passed through the month of Muharram, which is the first Islamic month in which we commemorate Ashura, the martyrdom of the grandson of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, Imam Hussain alayhi salam, and his family. And now we have just entered into the second Islamic month called Safar, in which we commemorate the sufferings, the hardships the family of Prophet went through, experienced. And despite all the hardship that they encountered in this month, the message that they delivered through their composure manifested, exhibited the message of humanity to the whole world. And in this regard, today we have invited two distinguished speakers, Father Professor Christopher Clohessy, all the way from Italy, Rome, and Dr. Hassan Abbas from Washington. Now, before I formally request Professor Christopher Clohessy to deliver his keynote speech, let me take an opportunity to introduce Father Clohessy. Professor Christopher Clohessy is a South African Catholic priest who holds a PhD from the Pontifical Urbanarium University in Rome and PhD from the Pontifical Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies, PISAI, also on Rome. He is at present a resident faculty member of that institute, lecturing there in Shia Islamic studies, Quranic studies, Islamic ethics, and Christian-Muslim dialogue, and is a visiting lecturer at the Pontifical Beda College in Rome, where he lectures in fundamental theology, ecclesiology, Islam, and Mariology. He's the author of Fatima, daughter of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and Half of My Heart, the narratives of Bibi Zainab, and Angels Hastening, the Karbala Dreams, all published by Gorgias Press. In 2021, he was one of the recipients of the Iranian World Book Award with the nomination Distinguished Researcher in Shia Islam. Professor Clohessy is at present researching in the preparation for a new book on Ghazi Abbas and Shah ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. And our other speaker after Professor Clohessy is Dr. Hassan Abbas, who is a distinguished professor of international relations at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. He served as a senior advisor at Project on Shiism and Global Affairs at Harvard University, and his current research work focuses on building narratives for countering political and religious extremism and rule of law reforms in developing states. Previously, he served as the distinguished Qaid-e-Azam professor at Columbia University. He has held fellowships at Harvard Law School, Islamic Legal Studies program and program on negotiation, and Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He holds a PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University, and an LLM in International Law from the Nottingham University, UK, and an MA in Political Science from the Punjab University, Pakistan. His latest book is The Prophet's Heir, The Life of Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, which was published by Yale University in March 2021, bringing to light the great personality, struggles, and teachings of Imam Ali alayhi salam for a broader international audience. His earlier works includes The Taliban Revival, again from the Yale University Press 2014, that chronicles the Taliban survival and resurgence after 2001 through the first-hand research and interviews in the area. Now, the modus operandi of today's session is that first we'll request Professor Father Christopher Clohessy to deliver his keynote for about 15 minutes, and then we'll request Dr. Hassan Abbas to deliver his keynote for about 10 minutes. And then we'll open the floor for question and answers. It's important imperative from housekeeping. May I request the esteemed audience to please keep their webcams turned off and microphones muted, so we can remain focused on the speaker's keynote speeches. Now, without further delay, let me request Father Clohessy to please proceed with your session, and I will just make you this, and I'll just give you, I think you're unmuted, Father Christopher, already, sir.
Yeah, thank you. So it's always a great honor for me to attend these functions, whether they be online or in person. Not just a great honor, but also something of a surprise that I keep getting invited back. And I say that because my knowledge of Shia Islam is a book knowledge, of course. It is an academic knowledge, but many of the people listening have a far more profound knowledge, experience of Shia Islam than I do. So I'm always quite humbled, and I regard myself really as a student rather than a teacher. And I'm honored to be again with Professor Abbas, because we were online together not so long ago talking about his superb book on Ali, one of the best things I've written on Ali, and I was delighted to read it. So I want to say a few words about virtue and about human beings or human events as models of virtue, specifically how the battle or the event, let's say, of Karbala, because Karbala is much more than a battle. It's a whole event, it's a lifestyle, it's a space that people now inhabit. So let's just say the Karbala event, but also some of the important people, members of the Ahl Bayt, who are directly or indirectly involved with Karbala. Lady Fatima, the mistress of the woman of paradise, who of course is the mother of Al Hussain, and who will be dead by the time that he takes his stand for justice, but very much present to him as the intercessor through her tears. And then Lady Zainab, his sister, and Al Hussain himself, and perhaps we could say a few words about Al Abbas. The point being that when we're talking about Karbala, we have no shortage of supremely good models for humanity. And so we're looking at how these human beings and how this event elicits virtues that people could imitate and live, because it's not so much people we want to imitate, it's virtues lived by people that we want to imitate. So I would suggest, and this is a personal thought, I would suggest that the lives of Lady Fatima, of Lady Zainab, of Al Hussain, of Al Abbas, of all the other members of the Ahl Bayt, and I would say this about all the members, all the key members of the Prophet's family, I would say that their lives are complex enough and intense enough to warrant some sort of key to unlock their mystery, to unlock the secrets of their lives, the secrets of how they lived their relationship with each other and their relationship, of course, with God. And what we're looking for here, to use a fancy word, is a hermeneutic key. In other words, a key that unlocks interpretation, so that the life of a group of people who lived so many hundred years ago could be as vivid and as fresh in the 21st century as they were 400, 500, 600, 800 years ago, almost 1,000 years ago. So it's a hermeneutic key that I'm looking for, an interpretive key to unlock their lives, because we need elements, you and I, elements of their virtue to resonate and echo in our own lives, in our marriages, our relationships, in the workplace, in schools and in universities, in our communities. And for that to happen, we have to unlock some of the mysteries, and we have to correctly interpret the actions and the words of these people, because they could easily be misunderstood and misinterpreted or used for the wrong motive. This is an easy thing, of course, as we know, in all religions, the misuse of sacred words or sacred texts, doing exactly the opposite that they were meant for. So even if these two women, especially Lady Zainab, Lady Fatima, her precious mother, even if these two women lived their lives within the ambit, within the borders or the confines of Shia Islamic faith, we could say this of both of them, of course, although some people might like to call them pioneers, maybe proto-Shia, that they followed this tashayyuh, this tendency that would eventually become the theology and the spirituality of Shia Islam. But I would suggest that even though they lived their lives within the ambit of Shia faith, lived and practiced, the interpretive key is not a Shia key to unlock their lives. We have to release them from the narrow confines of one particular expression of religion in order to make them available as models of virtue for a much wider group of people. I would say it's not even a religious key that unlocks the secrets of their lives, because one of the things that we have to admit, whether we are religious or not, but especially those of us who could be called, I suppose, professional religious people, one of the things we have to admit is that virtue is not confined to religious people only. There are countless people who have no particular religious understanding or faith or practice, but who live lives that are supremely, sometimes heroically virtuous. And we simply have to admit this. Because after all, religion itself is a virtue. Religion primarily is the virtue by which we give to God the honor that is his due, that is his right in all justice. So religion is a virtue that some people choose to live, whether well or badly, and other people choose to ignore. But there are countless people who ignore the virtue of religion, but who live other virtues without a religious angle supremely well. And I would like to suggest that religious people can be models for them also, because it's not the religion so much as the virtue of these lives that we're examining. You can't ignore religion, of course. People would like to do that, but you can't ignore religion, because religious beliefs, or if you like, the lack of religious beliefs, constantly shape the way people understand the world and understand how the world is to be negotiated. Anybody who wants to understand the world and how to live a life in it that is productive and in any way normal needs to take into account religious belief, because it is a central dimension of human life. But virtue falls outside of the bounds of religion, and other people are virtuous too. Nonetheless, what religion does do is it encourages virtue more than non-religion or a non-religious life. A religious life that is lived according to texts or to revelation encourages and urges us to virtue and offers us virtues that are pleasing to God, virtues that God has declared in his revelation to be righteous virtues, to be virtues that lead to a certain uprightness of life. Nonetheless, virtues remain a human thing. And in order to learn virtue, we have to practice them. This is what Aristotle said. You become virtuous by practicing virtue, in the same way that a pianist becomes a pianist by practicing the piano. And so if we want to practice virtue, it's a good idea to look at people who have gone before us and who have done it marvelously well, like Lady Zainab and Lady Fatima and Al-Hussein and his brother Al-Abbas. So the reason that I, as a non-Muslim, am attracted by such people and am able to draw inspiration and courage from such people, from the lives of people like Lady Zainab and Lady Fatima, despite the fact that they lived with a religious vision that is different to mine, is because the key to unlocking the mystery of their lives is not a religious key, it's a human key. It's a human key that helps us to understand the meaning of their lives here on earth and how we can imitate not them, but the virtues that they offer us. We want to humanize them. And we want to humanize them without in any respect diminishing the perfections, and in the case of Lady Fatima, especially the isma, this quality that she possesses to such fullness, without diminishing that, her perfection, her sinlessness, her state of being immaculate or of being infallible, that however you want to understand isma, And in Lady Zainab's case, a sort of a secondary isma by her association with the primary members of the Ahlul Bayt. Without diminishing any of that, we want to humanize them. Because if they're not human, they can't be models for us. We need human models, people who have known what it is to hunger and thirst and to bleed and to suffer and to weep. If they've not experienced those things, they are of little use for us in our own daily lives. And in fact, the truth is that Lady Fatima has this virtue of isma. She's ma'asuma by the very fact that she's a human being. A non-human being can't have isma. A non-human being, an animal, for example, can't have such perfection. And God doesn't need isma. He is way beyond it. So her virtue of isma, of being masuma, that is by the very fact that she is a human being, and therefore to humanize her doesn't in any way detract from that quality. But we humanize her because we need her to be a model of virtue for those who stand outside of religion or of her particular religious belief, and those who stand within it. We have to remind ourselves that a person's life is not defined by the level of academic success that they achieve or professional success. It's not defined by how much money people make or their social standing in the community. A person's life is defined by how they live. It's defined by what they become, so that the life of these members of the Ahlul Bayt, Lady Fatima, Lady Zainab, they become for us what they lived, models of virtue. So we imitate them for how they lived, for what they became, not as carbon copies. There's a great tendency in religion, in all religion, for us to attempt to make ourselves carbon copies of the saints or the awliya or the Ahlul Bayt or whichever group it is that has gone before us as models of virtue. But we're not meant to be doing that. We're not meant to be making ourselves carbon copies, because if we try to do that, we are denying the intrinsic value that each of us has as a creature of God, that God has placed into each of us a certain number of gifts and talents and abilities that he desires us to use for his greater glory. And to be a carbon copy of someone we are not is not a good way of living religious life, which is why I said at the beginning, it's not them we imitate, but the virtues, the universal virtues that they lived so perfectly. And why? Well, because all of this, living virtuously, but truly virtuously, all of this is an antidote to the great disease of our time. And the great disease of our time is the ego, human ego, of course, human self-centeredness and self-absorption. The ego is the great counter value, the great counter virtue, which we have to defeat in some way. The ego is the anger I feel when I can't have what I want immediately. It's the irritation that I feel when others are more prominent than I am and people are being fussed over more than I am. Or the fury that I feel when I'm not the center of attention all the time, everywhere. Or when my needs are not immediately satisfied. Or the inner rage that I feel when other people have things that I want and can't have. And then you look at Lady Fatima going out of the house after the death of her father, going out in spite of her sorrow and her grief and her physical weakness after the event that took place at the door of her house, going out with her last drop of physical energy to try to explain to people the rights of her husband Ali. That's an antidote to ego. Or you see Lady Zainab, who left the comfort of her home and her family in order to accompany her brother to the horrors of Karbala, and we easily forget the horrors of that day and watching her whole family being killed. That's an antidote to ego. Or Abbas, standing with his ankles in the river Euphrates, refusing to drink a drop until he has given water to quench the first thirst of his companions. That's an antidote to ego. Or Hussain, who rejects all compromise, even little compromises, because there's some people who think we can't make big compromises, but maybe small ones. And Hussain teaches us that any compromise with evil, no matter how small, is simply unacceptable. And that's an antidote to ego. That's who these men and women are for me. Maybe not fathers, but for me. Al-Hussain, Al-Abbas, Lady Zainab, Lady Fatima. They are models of virtue who provide me, hopefully each day, with models of how to live a life that is without ego and self-absorption, but which is the antidote to the egotism in which we live. And so I thank you for this opportunity to say a few words about people who are very special to me and precious to me. I'm only now discovering the wonders of Al-Abbas, and I look forward to discovering more. But in the meantime, I am delighted that I was invited to be with you, and I look forward to listening to Professor Abbas.
Thank you very much, Father Christopher Clohessy, indeed very eloquent. And now I request Dr. Hassan Abbas, if you kindly turn on your webcam and microphone so we can hand over you for the keynote. Let me give Dr. Hassan Abbas, make him the spotlight for everyone. There you go. Thank you, Dr. Sir. Thank you very much.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most beneficent, the most merciful. I am truly honored for this opportunity, and it's a double privilege and an honor to join the panel with Professor Clohessy. I really say it not out of courtesy, but having read his work and having been inspired by his work. I was just very recently finishing the book, which I want to mention, Angels Hastening, the Karbala Dreams by Professor Clohessy. It's every page is an amazing story. I'm thinking of how to thank him. We are all in his debt for his scholarship, for his brilliance, and for sharing this wisdom at a global level. I'll borrow this word from his presentation. He so rightly said, we need to release and unlock these great personalities we are talking about from the confines of one group or one school of thought. Because I'm reminded of the great words of Ali Shariati, the great Iranian scholar as well, who had said very critically that the Shia Muslims have built walls around them themselves in a different sense. So this is, I'm saying it is a positive or as a constructive critique. The message of these models, the personalities of these great heroes and women leaders have to be shared globally. And there's nothing that stops Muslims from doing that. I will just, to connect the two thoughts, Professor Clohessy talked about, we referred to his two great books on the two great women personalities, and that reminded me of some verses from Iftikhar Arif, which I'll take liberty to mention very briefly in Urdu, and then I'll translate in English, and then I'll come to the to some of my thoughts on how the personality of Imam and Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib is so relevant globally in this day and age. But first, because I was inspired, as soon as I heard Professor Clohessy, I looked for this small book that I have called by Iftikhar Arif, Shahre Ilm Ke Darwaze Par, on the door of knowledge. And there, this one, these set of verses which says, Hal Jazal Ehsan Illa Ehsan. He says, and I'll translate it, Ajab ek silsila hai, Khatija, Fatima, Zainab, Wafa ke baab mein, Sidko Safa ke baab mein, Sabro Raza ke baab mein, kaisa munawwar rasta hai. Khatija, Fatima, Zainab, Tulue harfe ikra se sadaye istighasa tak, हिरासे करबला तक मशीयत ने जो एक खते जली खींचा हुआ है, इसी का नूर है जो दिल मंजिल बे मंजिल हर तरफ फैला हुआ है. रिसालत की गवाही हो, विलायत की गवाही हो, इमामत की गवाही हो, जो ये कह दे वही मीज़ान हक में मुस्तनद माना गया है. ये हम जो आज भी दुनिया में पहचाने गए हैं, लाइके इकराम गर्दाने गए हैं, इन्हीं के दर का सदका है, इन्हीं की सब अता है. खतीजा, फातिमा, ज़ैनब, अजब एक सिलसिला है. वफा के बाब में, सिद्को सफ़ा के बाब में, सब्र रज़ा के बाब में कैसा मुनव्वर रास्ता है. For the benefit of some of us here who are not familiar with the Urdu language, it says, what a beautiful pathway. Khadija, Bibi Khadija, the wife of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Bibi Fatima Zahra and Bibi Zainab, that their pathway and their tradition is one of loyalty, one of truthfulness, one of patience, and one of accepting the will of God. And he says this beautiful pathway that each one of these great ladies had, this starts from the cave of Heir, where the Prophet had started contemplating, thinking, receiving God's messages, and from that point to the Karbala. And on each of the most significant moments of Islamic history, whether it was prophethood, or it was Vilayat-e Ali, or it was the sanctity of Imamat, it was these ladies at witnesses which really made the difference. I hope I was able to translate at least the meaning, the broader meaning accurately, but this gels so well with the ideas that Professor Clohessy had shared with us. Moving to Hazrat Ali alayhi salam, and thinking of these, how we unlock and release the great message and teachings, because let's be very honest. In fact, in reference to Bibi Khatija, Bibi Zainab, and Bibi Fatima as well, it is worth looking into how Shias and broader Muslims more so, they refer to these great personalities. I would add Bibi Fatima bint Asad, Bibi Amina, these great women ladies. And when I was working on Hazrat Ali's book, I realized that each of the Imams were surrounded by women of such high caliber, and those women had played, and not only an important role, they played a phenomenal role. Without those roles, I dare say the message could not have been conveyed. The whole mission would have remained unaccomplished. But how much of this has been internalized by Muslims and by all those who claim to love the Ahlul Bayt, the family of the Prophet? Honestly, can we really project to at a global level that this is what Muslims really believe in? Do they think whether the scholarship and wisdom of Bibi Fatima or the heroic leadership of Bibi Zainab in Karbala, do you see the role models among the Muslims who have accepted this and produced more? There are many great Muslim women. In Morocco, the Fatima had built the first university to this day. There are so many. But in a country like Pakistan, which had produced the leader of Benazir Bhutto, I'm not now talking in a political sense, but a lady who was told when she wanted to be prime minister that there is a fatwa, the religious edict, that no Muslim women cannot hold a leadership position, and she defeated that. This argument should have been easier to make in Pakistan, where now there are many bright young women police officers as well who are doing tremendous job. But by and large in society, the role of women, even those who claim they love Fatima and Zainab, are they ready to allow their daughters, their sisters, their mothers to play the role that they claim that this is the message? That's not the case. And that's the tragedy. Coming on Imam Ali, I went on that because I was really struck by the framing of Professor Clohessy. He's absolutely right about releasing and unlocking the potential of this message. On Imam Ali, all I'll do is in my 2, 3, 4 remaining minutes, his message, which links to the universal message, and it's so easy because anyone who will look at his sermons and his statements will immediately realize that he can so easily be, his message and teachings can be taught in international courses on ethics, on religion, on interfaith. I'll just mention to you his last words, and Tabri quotes it, the great Sunni historian. He states that on deathbed, this is what Imam Ali said, it will take a couple of minutes, it's worth reading it, because there are 4 or 5 messages which are so complete in itself, this sermon, in terms of his message. He says, do not seek this world even if it seeks you. Do not weep for anything that is taken away from you. Speak the truth. Show compassion for the orphan. Succor those who are anxious. My prayer and my ritual, my life and my death belong to God, the Lord of the worlds, who has no partner. Hold fast to the rope of God and avoid discord. We know about this Quranic verse also. Then he said, I heard Abul Qasim, the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, saying, this is the most important word. He's quoting the Prophet saying, the renewal of unity is better than all your prayer and fasting. And the renewal of unity is about defeating extremism. It is about pushing back terrorism. It is about pushing back discord. And then he said, fear God with regard to those who have a right to your protection and hospitality. Fear God with regard to the protection granted by your prophet, and do not allow the dhimmi, the non-Muslim, to be oppressed among you. Now he's on his deathbed, making his final statement. How many Christians and Jews were in Medina at that time? Very few. But he thought that out of the 5 or 6 central themes, he has to mention this. Are Muslims taking care of the Hindus in Pakistan? Are you taking care of Christians in Pakistan? Do you think they are equal citizens in any Muslim country? Well, if anyone who wants to claim that they love Ali, and it is so surprising, this is almost identical to the last message. I'm not talking about the speeches. I'm talking about the last message on the deathbed for the Prophet. Almost identical. When his head was in the lap of Ali, he also mentioned him. And I'm mentioning this because this is not mentioned in our mainstream speeches and discourse. In the last couple of minutes, other than this message, which is self-evident, I would argue that the very first other sermon, this was the last message. The very first sermon, Imam Ali started off by saying, everyone is equal before the law. He said, no nobility, no privileges. The second thing he said, I am accountable to you. I'm answerable to you. I'm sitting in front of you. He had 3 kinds of enemies. I'm just giving an example. Some from his own great personality of Imam Ali. And I thought that that's relevant. Thank you very much again for the opportunity. I look forward to a conversation and dialogue. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Abbas. And indeed, you touched upon the topic, which is the need of the hour. Folks, we are now open for question and answer. So if you have any questions, you could either insert it in the chat box, or you could request or raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on your console, so we can unmute you, or you can unmute yourself to ask. But let me moderate the session. Please feel free to write in the chat box or raise your hand so we can request you to unmute your microphone. But in the meantime, let me just kickstart first with Professor Christopher Clohessy, and may I request you all to also turn on your webcams, Dr. Clohessy and Dr. Hassan Abbas, so you guys remain visible to the audience. The question first to Professor Clohessy, I must say, quite impressed the way you have just described how you were intrigued towards Karbala and towards the family of Prophet and Ahlul Bayt. Coming to the point of Bibi Zainab Salamullah and Bibi Fatima Zahra Salamullah, and you mentioned about we need to humanize them, to consider them as role models. What about the skill sets that in today we can derive from or take an inspiration from, let's say from stress management? I mean, if we read all these stories in the history and how we commemorate and how we weep, most of the speakers in our commemoration, rituals, they talk about all the sufferings, but very few speakers come across who actually try to translate it into a learning, so we can be more receptive to understand how to manage anxiety, stress management, as they did it in such a profound environment that they went through it. Professor Clohessy, any thoughts on that?
Thank you. That's really very interesting, because one of the things that I tried to do when I was writing about the life of Lady Zainab, and of course, the life of Lady Zainab is a life in fragments, because there are big gaps in her biography about which we can do nothing. The sources, tell us nothing about big areas of her childhood. We know that she grew up in the family, the Prophet's household and in the family, but the details of day-to-day life are very few. And so it's only when we meet her as she leaves for Karbala that she becomes quite prominent in the text. And I was very interested in her psychological state. And I understand that she is the granddaughter of the Prophet of Islam. I understand that. I understand that she is that she shares in a sort of isma, a secondary isma. I understand that she holds a certain position. But I'm also reminded that, like Lady Fatima, she was an ordinary flesh and blood person too. She was a mother and a wife, a daughter, and she knew what it was to suffer pain and to bleed and to weep and to experience horror. And I was very interested by her psychological state, because there is a definite change in Lady Zainab on the night of Karbala, the night of between the 9th and the 10th of Muharram. There is a change. So there are a number of incidents that occur before the battle, on the journey there, and then on the days that they are already at Karbala and preparing themselves. She has a number of what can only be termed as breakdowns, where she breaks down into tears and has to be comforted by her brother, and in some cases by her nephew, Zain al-Abidin, who is instructed by his father, Al-Hussein, to comfort her, to calm her down, because she's suddenly beginning to realize that she's going to lose. She says, I've lost my mother, I've lost my father, I've lost my brother, and now am I going to lose Al-Hussein as well? And she's distraught. And then there are a number of other moments where she suffers a real breakdown. But on the morning or on the day of the battle, she emerges from the safety of the women's tents onto the field of battle into the midst of great danger. Battlefields are not places to wander around on, but she emerges deliberately in order to weep over the killing of probably her oldest nephew, Al-Hussein's oldest son, Ali al-Akbar, who is killed. And the texts say that she looked like the sun rising when she came out. She was radiant. They even noticed that her earrings reflected the sunlight as she walked across the field. This is a very different Lady Zainab from the night before. I don't think this is just a Shia commentator trying to make her into something she's not, because these are in the Sunni texts as well. In fact, it's primarily a Sunni author, Ibn Sa'ad, who says she looked like the sun rising. So there is a psychological shift overnight, and it has to do, no doubt, with her taking courage from her brother's words, because he encourages her, and maybe from the words of her nephew also, but also from her extraordinary prayer life. So I don't think that in any way we want to diminish the seriousness of mental health. It is, I think now, post-COVID, one of the most serious illnesses that we're going to see the effects of. And I think we're going to see the effects of COVID in a massive decline in mental health. And mental health is not solved by prayer alone. That would be, for me, a very fundamentalist way, that if you pray hard, your mental health will be fine. No, God has provided people with all kinds of remedies and professional people who would help. And the model for that is that at the end of all of this drama, when Yazid sends these women prisoners home, he sends Zain al-Abidin with them and says, you are the man to look after them. You are the one who needs to care for them. He understands that they're going to need the care of a good fellow Muslim. And I think that is, for me, a model of the fact that there are in our communities outstandingly good and upright people who have faith, but who also have skill, and that we need to do away with this taboo about mental health, that it's an embarrassment. No, it's an illness like any other illness. There's nothing to be embarrassed about. And as surely as if I break my arm, I'm not going to go to my bathroom and try and fix it with prayer and a bit of sticky tape. Well, if my mental health is suffering, then together with my prayer, I need to take some action and use the remedies available. And so for me, Lady Zainab, just to finish, is a very good model of the possibility that even mental health issues do not necessarily overcome the moments when we have to be courageous and brave. Real courage is that I'm courageous despite the issues that I have, not because of them. And she's a model of that for me.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you very much, Father Clohessy. And let me move to the question box. We have a few audience who want to also have an audio question, but let me just go to the chat box. We have from Mr. Mavadat Rana, Brigadier Mavadat Rana. The question is, let me say, what could be the reasons that the method and the practice of Islam by revered personalities we have discussed has no parallel in history since the 12th Imam? And if I may request Dr. Hassan Abbas with the supplementary, if I may add that Dr. Abbas, with this question asked by Brigadier Muwaddat Rana, and just to add up that what you delineated so eloquently about the meaning of peace in Islam, and Islam means peace. How come today we have more and more branding of Islam as we see swords and violence and wars? These are the flags that have been raised. These are the images that we are seeing in contrast, and it's compared to what we have seen in the history, how unity that you highlighted, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam kept on emphasized. And as Brigadier Muwaddat Rana asked, that we don't have any parallel to see after the 12th Imam.
Thank you so much. It's an important question. This is about heroes and leaders as well. Of course, no one can be compared in that sense to prophets. No work can be compared to the divine work. And these prophets and imams were also a divine art, if I may call that. But they, as Professor Clohessy had so rightly said, we have to continue to look at them in the context of their human efforts, their human struggles. For instance, whether it was Imam Ali and some of his close associates of Ahlul Bayt, they were facing jealousy from their contemporaries, which was a normal thing. Everyone else around them, some were greedy, some were more political. So there were all kinds of people, but there were feelings of jealousy. Also, these great personalities went through these struggles because Imam Ali knew his right was taken away. In many other cases, what must have gone through the hearts and minds of these great personalities when they were seeing the core messages of Islam being destroyed, being the ideas of Islam and the spirit of Islam being almost dismantled. So they went through those challenges, and they created these models which have to be seen in the context of human activity and human ideals. If these personalities had not gone through these struggles and these choices that they had to make, then if for example, if everything was destined in a sense, then Heir, Ohad, the bravery of Imam Ali, the courage cannot be properly recognized and credited. Later on, I think in a human sense, there were parallels of those people who were the close associates of these personalities. There were so many others who I would say, everyone who has offered his or her life for martyrdom, in any sense for a good cause, in the name of God, not challenging, not destroying somebody, not as a piece of violence, but in terms of standing up for the right, can be seen as their character as paralleling or in parallel to the great sacrifices. So we draw inspiration. So parallel may not be the most accurate word, and I'm sure that's what was meant by Shah Saab. It is supposed to be the inspiring and motivating factor. And that we don't know people's hearts, and we don't know how so many people across the world went through. I think if they had not been inspired and motivated, then the message of these great personalities would not have survived. The very fact that the message survived, it means there have been so many people historically who learned bits of pieces about the character, about the nobility, about the honor, and benefited from this light which enlightened their hearts. So there are still people, that's the purpose. If the role models are too different and too distinct and too saintly and too superhuman, then they are not role models for the human beings. So every role model, every prophet, every book, every idea was supposed to be fully implemented and fully followed up. And I think that must have happened I'm saying it at a philosophical level. Otherwise, the role model's attraction would have dimmed, and that is not dimmed. So there must have been some people whose hearts are so full of light, and they continue to show that light and share that light. That's why the models remain models in our hearts and minds. That's how I will put it. Thank you for the question.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Abbas. We have a couple of people who raised a hand. First, we had Syed Mujtaba, and then I have Mr. Miraj Imam. So let me request Mr. Syed Mujtaba to please unmute yourself and ask the question if you're still there.
Might be Syeda Amina Mujtaba.
All right, let me go to Mr. Miraj Imam Saab. You have raised your hand, but you have also posted a question. Would you like to ask yourself or you want me to read it? Mr. Miraj Imam. Let me try to read the question Mr. Miraj Imam has posted. My question is to Professor Clohessy from Mr. Miraj Imam. I'm amazed by his zeal about Bibi Fatima Zahra Salamullah and Bibi Zainab Salamullah, but I want to know how Professor Clohessy came to discover about these great ladies. Thank you. This is from Miraj Imam Saab from Toronto, Canada.
Thank you. Well, I have
Professor
told this,
Clohessy.
I have told this story often enough, so I will keep it brief. I decided to pursue an academic career in order to promote dialogue between Islam and Christianity, to pursue an academic career in studying Islam properly from an academic point of view. So I went to Cairo and I studied Arabic. My Arabic is a little better now than it was after the first year, and then came here to Italy to this Institute of Islamic Studies and followed a general course in Islam, but also part of the course was in Shia Islam. I was taught by an exceptionally good British professor, also a priest, a good Arabist, Michael Fitzgerald, who was a specialist in Shia Islam. And I was captivated by Karbala and thought to myself, well, I'm going to do something with that later on, not now, but later on I'm going to come back to Karbala. And so I came to do a doctorate and decided that I would do it on Al-Hussein from a Christian point of view. So as a Christian theologian, or really historian more than theologian, I would look at Al-Hussein. But of course, when you are writing about Al-Hussein, you discover Lady Fatima. And I was quite shocked that there were so few books about her. I mean, because she's very much like Mary in Catholic tradition. And yet if you go into any Catholic bookshop, there are shelves and shelves of books of theology of Mary, spirituality, history, but Lady Fatima, almost nothing. There were certainly some things in Farsi and in Arabic, but I thought very little, some things in Urdu also. So I set about to change my doctorate. I put Al-Hussein to the side for a moment and decided to write what I think was the first substantial academic biography of fragments of the life of Lady Fatima based on the Arabic sources. And then went on to write about Lady Zainab, and then some of the dreams that people like Salama had predicting the death of Al-Hussein. So most of my interest focuses on the Karbala event, both before and after, and some of the personalities that fill that event. Lady Fatima, of course, was there present in a particular way, as she is in every majlis, as is Lady Zainab, but that seems to be where it's going with me now, that I trained as a historian, and so I teach Shia Islamic theology, but mostly I teach Shia history. And so I have great reverence and respect for these members of the Ahl Bayt, and I am convinced that they serve as universal models, not religious models alone, but models to a much wider human community. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a detailed answer. And let me go back. I believe Sayyid Mujtaba Saab is back. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I have one question from Professor Christopher Clohessy. The question is, as he mentioned about Aristotle and the virtue and everything, I have one famous saying from Aristotle's teacher, Plato, in his book Republica. He said, virtue of knowledge is wisdom. So I just need to know, I mean, what is the parameter or indicator that, okay, now I am educated enough, learned enough that I become a wise man. And second question is not that related to it, but this is like a question that by the path of God, all the Osiyas and saints and Awliya Allah, their living is far, far difficult than of a common man. And why Allah choose them to be sacrificed for his way or for his path? We could have given them the easier, the simpler life, but their life is always, I mean, full of worldly miseries.
So philosophy is not my strong point. I'm arrogant enough to quote Aristotle, but But I know that Plato and Aristotle had two very different ideas about how we gain knowledge. And one speaks about ananetic remembrance, the idea of remembering stuff we know already, whereas Aristotle goes in a slightly different way. But Aristotle was convinced that virtue is a thing that one learns by practice, by living virtue. And this seems to me to be fairly logical. We are not, of course, the judges of our own status or our own levels. It is for God to judge us about how we've lived the virtues that we believe he has told us are the best virtues to live. But virtue also has a result in the community around us. And I wanted to say that in the context of the last question, because the truth is that these important members of the Ahl Bayt, Al-Hussein, Abbas, Lady Zainab, they were on a world stage. They took a stand for justice that was on a very public platform. And that is why their story is so well known, and that is why they are held out to us as models of virtue and how we know so much about them. And specifically that God places people in places of discomfort, because places of discomfort and pain are the places where we learn more than if our lives become comfortable. And therefore, suffering and martyrdom is part of the Shi'i theology of Imama and the theology of the Ahl Bayt, that God deliberately puts rights for people a certain amount of suffering. But for most of us, our lives are not lived on the world stage. We have to be role models in much smaller spaces, in our marriages, in our families, in our school, in our work. And if we can't do it there, then it's unlikely we can do it on a world stage. If I can't be a role model in my own family of integrity and justice and kindness, and no compromise, then it's unlikely that when I find myself, God forbid, plunged onto a world stage where I have to make moral decisions, it is unlikely I'd be able to do it, because I haven't been able to do it in little situations. Most of us are called upon to live lives that are truly godly and virtuous in very small spaces, but none of us would deny how difficult it is. It's not that it's easy to do it, but much more difficult to do it publicly. No, living a virtuous life is always going to be the harder, the more narrow path to live, because many of the virtues go against our natural egoistic human tendencies. We have to, the lower nafs versus the higher nafs, if you like. And we have to allow the one to defeat the other. So virtue is almost a supernatural path. It's not necessary. I mean, it's not a virtue is a human thing, but it leads us onto a path that is somewhat above the ordinary realm of human activity, because it invites a response from us that is not necessarily the norm. The norm for people is revenge. The norm is to get the last word in. The norm is all of that. But virtue invites us to something higher than that. And therefore, virtue will bring its own suffering. It brought suffering to Al-Hussein, his stand for justice, and it will bring suffering to us if we stand for virtue. But for most of us, it's going to be hidden in the confines of our own homes, so that each of our homes really has to be a little Karbala, where we stand always for truth and for what is right. I'm not sure if I answered your question fully. No. I'm sorry if I didn't.
I think you've done it quite well, very well explained. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Clohessy. And I'm just concerned about the clock and time, and we have a few more questions. So let me go straight jump and combine two questions. One from Ms. Maryam Abbas. I believe it's addressed, she didn't mention the name, but I believe it's addressed to Professor Dr. Abbas. How, in your view, today's generation can mediate the differences and rivalries between Shia and Sunni Muslims? I believe we need to represent one united Islam to the world rather than several versions. And to supplement, we have another one from Syeda Zainab, who also spoke about Shia building the wall, as you mentioned, Dr. Abbas. I believe Tabarra dissociation voiced in our sermons add fuel to the preaching, to the fire. Here we have Prophet, peace be upon him, preaching unity on his deathbed. And what are so-called the scholars doing rather than spreading enlightenment? They are. Any thoughts, Dr. Abbas?
Thank you so much, Ali. Both very profound and thoughtful questions. We need a separate session to answer those, because it's an entirely different domain. But what briefly I can say is, the central message is not to hate. One can celebrate differences. Look at Catholics and Protestants and others, religious traditions among Judaism, as well as among the Hindus. So to have different sects is not an issue per se, but to be hateful about the other is the challenge, and that is the issue. Lack of sane discourse and debate and respect for each other and tolerance for each other is the problem. So I would argue everyone should take pride in who they are, but don't hate the other. Violence is, of course, the extreme form of it. The example I would give, whether Ali ibn Abi Talib as the fourth caliph, he never distinguished between who was supporting him at the time of Saqif or not. He never asked that question. Imam Hussain in Karbala, one of his most important leaders and supporters, Heir, for example. Heir, till the final moment, was in Yazid's army. The moment he comes to him, he's not nagging him, he's not reminding him, you had stopped me a few days ago, you had always supported Yazid. Or Zuhair bin Khan, he was close associate of the third caliph and a friend of the second caliph. Imam Hussain welcomed him when he said he wants to support him in the Battle of Karbala. Was anyone who was against Hussein's father and who was in his political sense in a different side, whether that made any difference? It made no difference. So in our day-to-day lives, when we interact, when we talk, it should not matter at all. I mean, Sunnis should go to Shia mosques, Shia centers, Shias should go the other way around. The interactions have to take place. Anything that brings people together in the same religious space, in the same spiritual space, in terms of also respecting the other, not only tolerating, respecting the other view. And after a certain point, you will not be asked on the day of judgment, I guess, the question about other people's faith. Don't be judgmental. I mean, if we follow this path, these ideals, automatically relations between Shias and Sunnis will be better. And I'm really struck by what Professor Clohessy said. If we fail in our small spaces, I mean, I was thinking while listening to him, I'm miserably failing in my personal spaces. And we continue to think, oh, we will do so great if you get a larger responsibility. But if we are not following the pathway, the spiritual pathway, in our day-to-day life, in terms of backbiting, in terms of speaking the truth, in terms of respecting the other's views, then how can we just claim we'll do better in a different bit? I couldn't think of this example, a better example, to really force us to think inside our heart. And Ali, if there's a chance, I have a short question for Professor Clohessy. Can I ask now or later?
Sure. Let me just take one question, Dr. Abbas, and then I'll give it to you. So if you don't mind, let me take one question from the panel, because I'm curious about the time. We are already on the time, but let us take one question from the chat panel, and then we'll take it to Dr. Abbas, who can ask a question to Clohessy, Professor Clohessy. This question is from Mr. Neville Gaunt, who has, it's a bit, let me say, okay. Question is, today's Pakistan is promoting female entrepreneurship. Is there any opportunity for the experience and life of the Lady Fatima, Lady Fatima, to play a more significant part in helping women succeed? If yes, then please explain. Professor Clohessy, if you would like to touch base on it, or Dr. Abbas, I know we can take it towards Bibi Khatija, Salaamullah, also. She was one of the most renowned entrepreneur women in the era, the mother of Bibi Fatima.
Yeah, I'm not well informed about Pakistan and the situation there, so it's a bit difficult for me to relate her to that. But if I were to relate her to the wider human community, of course, we have to ask ourselves in the end some very difficult questions. Who is it who prevent women from taking their rightful place? Am I doing it? Is it my society? Is it my religion? Is it my culture? What is it that stops women from taking their rightful place? I think of some countries, for example, Iran, where huge numbers of women go to university and study. It's a source of national pride, and I think that Lady Fatima would be very much behind that. But there are other places, of course, where women have less chance for education. So it's not really a question I can answer, because I don't really know the the situation intimately there in Pakistan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'll just move to Dr. Hassan Abbas if you would like to make a comment or a straight move ahead towards your question also.
Absolutely. A comment is about some of the questions on the side, which are very thoughtful questions. In brief, I can say on one of those comments on why women are not imams or prophets. I think in some cases, women, some of the most important women were given, this is my personal view, were given status and role which was even more important than imams and prophets. It can be controversial, I've just said what I've just said, because you'll have to see how the message of imams and prophets survived. Those who played a critical role in the survival of the message were in no way lesser in status or in credentials than the men, if I may say that. My question to Professor Clohessy is, and this is not in any way a return favor, this is, I want to learn really, and I think our audience as well, if you can share, if Muslims have to read today some biographies of leading Christian personalities, who should we read? Of course, Jesus and all the greatest in our tradition, the Spirit of God. I mean, that's a given. I've had a chance to read some of the phenomenal biographies, but among the other personalities, and if you would like a Muslim scholar to attempt writing a book, a biography on any of the great Christian personalities, which I may take a shot at some point, where should we begin from? Any guidance on that?
Thank you. Well, I live, of course, in Italy. And in Italy, St. Francis of Assisi is the most outstanding character, not for any small reason. He is regarded as the closest imitator of the person of Jesus. So I'm thinking now of the person of Jesus from a Christian point of view, that Francis, in his medieval period, and he lived in a very brutal period, where there was a great deal of disease and violence and misery, Francis of Assisi was the person who came closest, it is generally believed, to imitating the person of Jesus. Now, I know that there is this famous story about St. Francis going to meet the Sultan. I think it's not true. I hate to say that, but there are no Islamic sources for this. And Islam would have made a note of this if it had happened. I think probably it's a story that was created, because it is unlikely that Francis crossed the battlefield and spoke in classical Arabic it is unlikely. So nonetheless, it's an interesting story. But the other aspects of Francis's life, his voluntary poverty, his penance, his life of penance, very much like some of the early mystics of Islam, his choosing voluntarily not to marry so that he could give himself more wholeheartedly to God. This is an interesting man because he lives a very simple life based on what the Gospels say about virtue. And so there's nothing complex about him. He's not a profoundly political figure, and his spirituality is not so deep. It's not like reading Ghazali, where you really have to battle to get to understand. No, Francis of Assisi is very simple, and in this, he becomes a wonderful model of a virtuous life. So if somebody were to write on him, I would be delighted, of course. And the Italians would be delighted as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm just reading one question, if you both allow me. So if I just read this one last question, which I believe is very relevant and pertinent to what we are going through, the current affairs. The question is from Ms. Saba, that how did the survivors at Karbala, who were subjected to intense suffering, oppression, and violence, set a standard or showed us ways for humanity to deal with human trauma, loss, grief, pain, ethics of dealing with oppression and oppressors, especially how do we see this practically from the lives of Ahl al-Bayt post-Karbala? Now, this is a very important question, if I believe, considering today's current affairs, geopolitical scenarios, the oppression, the sufferings that various parts of the world are going through. Any response? And with that response, we would also like to do a concluding message through the same answers for both panelists. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll start and I'll go very quickly. Of course, there is this famous theology, and it comes from Hollywood, of all places, but it's quite true that if you ask God for patience, for sabr, he won't give you patience, doesn't do that. What he does is he gives you opportunities to learn and practice patience. If you ask God for integrity or for the virtue of justice, he doesn't give it to you so that you have it. Rather, he gives you opportunities to be just or to be kind or to be fair. And so all of these sufferings that people go through, and this is on one level, are opportunities given by God to react in a completely ungodly human way, which is with anger or revenge, or to act in a more godly way, which is with virtue. They're the opportunities he gives us to practice the virtues that we so desire. However, that doesn't mean that we should allow suffering to continue because it becomes a good thing. No, suffering's never a good thing. Good can come out of suffering, but suffering can never be a good thing. It can be an instrument that God uses to chastise us or to warn us or to purify us. But we should, despite all suffering, despite the fact that it can teach us how to live more virtuously, we should do everything in our power to fight injustice and to fight suffering and to take a stand against these things. So there has to be a balance between those two. And I finished by saying that tonight I wanted to mention this, that we prayed especially for the repose of the soul of Sayyid Riaz Hussain Jafri and Sayyida Iftiar Begum. And I come from a tradition where we do pray for our dead, our loved ones who have gone before us. And so we pray that both of them may find paradise and be at peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Clohessy. Thank you indeed. And Dr. Abbas, any quick concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
I think the beautiful prayer with which Professor Clohessy ends, I would just reiterate that and request all of the audience, because what the message he mentioned, I think I second that wholeheartedly. That's true. I would just like to conclude with the recitation of Surah Fatiha for the souls of your parents, Ali Karan Jafri and his wife. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen ar-Rahman ar-Rahim Maliki Yawmiddin Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in Siratal Mustaqim Siratal Ladzina an'amta 'alayhim Bismillah
Thank you very much. And I really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, Professor Father Christopher Clohessy and Dr. Hassan Abbas, who have committed a considerable time, or more than an hour, on this special interactive, unique session that we had. I hope the audience found it useful, and this endeavor to spread the message of Karbala, how it attracts common virtues of humanity in this global arena. And I would like to also conclude, which Al-Quran says, which we have just discussed in the end about the sufferings, that there comes an ease after every hardship. So the reality is that the hardship is the part of this life that we are going through. But once we, as Father Clohessy mentioned beautifully, that suffering is not good. I mean, we must take a stand, but if we take it as an opportunity, this enables us to practice all those skills on which we have been declared as Ashraful Makhlukat, above all other creatures and communities. That is where the emotional resilience part comes in. That's the whole learning part comes in when we go through all these case studies in the history. So thank you very much, Professor Christopher Clohessy and Dr. Hassan Abbas, for eloquently delivering your keynote speeches and answering the question and answers. Indeed, thank you for all of you, those who are present and those who have posted the questions and made it quite an interactive experience for all of us. Thank you very much. Jazakallah khair. I wish you all good luck. So you all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you have dialed in from. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you. I'm going to end this meeting, so you all will be automatically dismissed.